Okay, so a little bit of an update now. Been busy doing some work. One of the things I did was I cleaned off all the gasket material on the gearbox itself on this side of the box. It was a bit of a chore. I just took the wire brush to it though, and the hardest part was underneath the bottom there. But I got it all up. Taking the wire brush to it, and on the other side where the crankshaft comes out of the engine, there's a gasket there that goes behind the primary case. That was stuck to the engine as well, so that took a bit of prying stuff off. I wanted to be sure not to mar the face, the aluminum face. And I took the wire brush to that, so that took some time, but I got that off. One thing I did notice was the both of those gaskets and the one on the other side on the gearbox cover, when I took it off, I actually didn't think there was a gasket there, but there was. It was very, very thin. Both of these gaskets were really thin, that thin black. I don't know what the material was. I don't know, flexitalic or whatever it was, but really thin. So it actually tricked me on the other side. At first I thought, oh, there's no gasket, but there was a gasket. So I've got I've got a gasket set that I ordered years ago, and I'm going to be able to use up these gaskets, and now I've got a use for them. Over here you can see what I did today, which was I heated up the gearbox case with my hot air gun first, my heat gun, and then I hit it with the butane torch here on the outside and got it nice and warm. Not so hot that you couldn't touch it, but it was uncomfortable to the touch. And then I got my bearing, which I'd been keeping in the freezer, so it was whatever it was, -4 or -5, whatever the temperature of my freezer is. So nice and small, and I got the hole as big as I could. Gave it a bit of oil, and I'll show you the rig that I used to pull it in. One of the things I did have to do, and I should have filmed it before, but when I took the old one out, the edge, the inside edge of where the bearing goes in, was very rough. It was very sharp, and there were actually pieces, there were actually chunks missing out of it, and I don't think that was, there was nothing in the gearbox, nothing that had gotten chewed up, so I think those were actually pieces that were from the casting of the box. But what I did was I just took a round file, and I just kind of went at it at an angle, probably 45 degrees all the way around inside, and just to round that off a little bit, just to put a little bit of a chamfer there, on the edge, so that when the bearing came in, it wasn't hitting something sharp. It was rounded off all the way around, and that worked out very well. It didn't take much meat off, just enough to take off that sharp edge. And I just went around with my finger afterwards, and you could feel where I had rounded it over, and it worked out perfectly. So I'm going to show you what's next, what the next steps are. You can see here one of the things, I think I talked about it earlier in another video, but one of the things that I did to kind of improve this linkage a bit, this bolt was missing, this pinch bolt, so I replaced that. I put that on, so that should actually help a lot because the shaft was able to slide back and forth. As well, one of the things I did, besides taking all these linkages off, and there's another linkage underneath, was I greased them up, but I didn't put any different bushings in. I stayed with the nylon bushings. They weren't cracked. They weren't falling apart. They were there. They were dirty, and I just cleaned everything up. But one of the things I did was I put on these cotter pins. The cotter pins that were in there were very tiny. They were very tiny, and they allowed that shaft, that pin, to move back and forth quite a bit. There was a lot of slop here. This thing was able to move quite a bit. So by putting in a thicker cotter pin, one that actually fit snugly in the hole, took off a lot of that slop. So you can see that now there's not really a whole lot of slop there. It moves as a single unit. The two pieces don't move against each other. So that should really improve the shifting quite a bit. And of course it's loose because it's missing, the connection's missing on the other side there of the gearbox. So we'll get to that. So here's my new bearing. It went in really nice. I got it in just fine. It's sealed bearing, as you can see, and of course then I got the rubber seal. I'm going to replace the rubber seal on this side later on, but I am going to put that on. I thought quite a bit about this, but whether or not to take off the inner seal so that it was exposed to the oil. And I was like, I might do that, and I ended up, I left both seals in place. Sealed bearings, you know, like they can last and last and last. There's grease in there, and at least I know it's clean, and it's clean grease. So we'll see how it goes, because with the failure that I had on the kickstart bearing, where the cage had just disintegrated, it wasn't getting lubrication, I was really disappointed with that, and for sure that one I left sealed. I wasn't going to take off the inner seal. I know I had lots of advice to take off the inner seal and let the oil, the gear oil inside the gearbox circulate around. But when I looked at that failure, and I'm like, you know what, the oil that was in there wasn't getting up to that bearing, and it just fell apart. So it could have been a faulty bearing, but it also could have been that it wasn't getting lubrication. So I decided not to remove the seal on that. At least now I know I've got two bearings that are lubricated and are going to stay lubricated. I know grease isn't the best, but it's packed with grease inside there, hopefully. So anyway, let's have a look over here. We'll go over to the bench. So I'll just show you what I did. It was a little bit of a tool, I guess. This is the old bearing that came out of the bike, the old main bearing on the drive side, and I used that to drive in the new bearing because I didn't have a washer that was big enough to go around to the outer race. So one of the things I did, I had this washer, and I didn't have anything on the outside or big enough to go around the outside, like I say, but this acted on the inner race of the old bearing, and it didn't apply any pressure to the inner race of the new bearing. That was transferred via the outer race. What I did was I made up these little cardboard spacers, and the purpose of them, I just used my punches, and I just took a piece of cardboard and punched them out. Because I was doing this by myself, and I was putting this thing in from the kickstart side and going through like this with the new bearing here, and where these spacers are, that's where the new bearing fit. I was doing this by myself, so it was I wanted to see if I could get it to stay there and not just fall back into the gearbox as I was trying to work on the drive side. So these spacers worked really well. They as you can see, right, they held the bearing I was using to drive, as well as the new bearing. They held them in place quite nicely. So I put that through, and then what I used was, it went through the gearbox case, and then on the other side I just used the drive sprocket, the flat side of the drive sprocket, put that here, and I put one washer over, and the nut, and I just took my ratchet, and reaching over the seat, I had my left hand holding the wrench on this nut, holding that still, and then I just slowly ratcheted here on the kickstart side, and yeah, it worked out really well. Pulled it in nicely. I had given it a bit of oil on the new bearing. I'd given just a dollop of oil around the outside so it would lubricate, but yeah, it went in quite well. So that worked out fine. And I've got two covers. So here's the new cover. Here's the undamaged one. The one that I had originally on the bike is damaged. So I'm going to repair it. It's not irreparable, but I got a new one. So this new one is here, and it came with this bearing here on the kickstart side. And as I say, I didn't want an open bearing. I'm not convinced that this thing's going to be lubricated properly, and I don't like the feel of it anyway. So I replaced it with a sealed bearing, and I'm leaving it sealed on the inside too. Don't like the way that they got it set up, so I'm just going to leave that sealed. Then I know that's good. And you can see how the old bearing just fell apart. And what ended up happening, there's the balls in there. What ended up happening was the cage that held the balls in place just disintegrated. It failed. It wasn't getting lubricated, and it luckily isn't hardened steel like the inner and outer races are and the balls. So the gear set was able to chew up that metal for the cage that held the balls in place, and all I ever found was two tiny pieces of that cage. The rest of it was ground into this fine paste in the gearbox that I ended up having to clean out. So yeah, I'm a little bit leery. I think I mentioned it in one of my other videos as well. These are the bearings. The main bearings is 6206 RS in this case because it's a rubber seal, and the one on the kickstart side is a 6303. I'm trying to remember. I had originally bought the wrong bearing because I'd gone off, I think it was the Pete Snidel manual, had the wrong number for the bearing there. So I bought that bearing, and then when I came to put it in, I discovered it was the wrong one. The outside diameter was right, the width was right, but the inside diameter was wrong. It was too small, if I recall. So I ended up Found out what the real one was by popping out this and then reading it, 6303, and then just went and got a sealed 6303. So now the next steps. What I'm going to do is I'm going to polish, just give a nice polish on the aluminum, the outside of the inner cover here, and then the outer cover. I'm going to polish that up a little bit, get that nice and shiny. That won't take too long. Just put it on my buffing wheel. Clean those up. I went out and I got a new O-ring for my Kickstarter because my intention is to use gear oil in the box now. So that's a potential spot where it could leak out. And the other one was pretty flattened, so I thought now I'll get a brand new O-ring that's going to help to seal in the oil anyway. I did end up having to take this apart. There's just this little plunger and a spring inside, and this guy slides off. Like you just hold the plunger in to take the tension off of that, and I slid it off, and it was full of. Oops! Sorry about that. I mistakenly zoomed in here. Not what I wanted to do. There we go. Sorry about that. I ended up having to take that off to clean out a lot of the swarf and the metal pieces that were inside there. So I cleaned that up, and we're there. And then the gear set, I got this just together here on the bench just to give you an idea how it's going to go back in together. This is going to be the drive side here. That's the axle that goes through. Here's the gear sets, so you get the larger gear. So this will be the drive side of the bike. This is the kickstart side of the bike. You get the lay shaft down here. You get the fork. Oh, I got that upside down actually. There we go. That's the right way to do that. So when you look at the fork, you can see there are marks here from the gears themselves, the different size gears. And when you look at them, you can see, I think you can see that in the reflection, right? So you can see that one's the smaller mark here. And that one's a little bit bigger, so you know that it goes in this way. You can orient yourself. It's going to go in this way. And, oops, those go together. There we go. There it go. Goes like that. And then it goes up in here between those two guys. Now, it's going to be fun when I go to fit this back in. I've watched lots of videos of guys putting these gear sets back in. The guys that seem to have the easiest time are the guys that actually have the gearbox out of the bike. So, there's going to be a lot of fiddling because there's the fork that has to come down for you're selecting the gears, for pushing the gears back and forth, and that's got to fit over these two pins here. But I'll get it. Other folks get it. It may take a little bit of swearing, and that'd be fine. But I'm usually pretty patient about this sort of stuff. If I start getting frustrated, I just stop and I go away. So anyway, so that's where we're at with this. So my next job now is to get busy polishing up my cases.